Welcome to Kubernetes SIG Architecture for Thursday, April 25th, 2019. We'll get started today. My name is Matt Farina. I'll be kind of chairing us along. The agenda and notes for today's meeting are at bit.ly/SIG-architecture. I'll actually drop that in here. And the first thing we have up on the agenda is we're going to do an issue triage session. Brian, are you on? Brian Grant?
Sorry, Brian's coming from another meeting, so he's a couple minutes late right now. Can you push this down the agenda?
Sure, we'll go ahead and push this one down the agenda. Thanks. So the next thing we have is we were going to talk about release postmortems. Dims, can you talk about that?
Hi. So in this meeting, we don't want to go over the exact list of things that were either broken or got patched in subsequent patch releases or things like that. But we can do that in a subsequent meeting. But right now, I was trying to bring awareness to the fact that there are things that are breaking in the .0 releases which get fixed. And sometimes it's very hard for people who are adopting the latest releases. They'll have to wait for a few dot releases before things get stable, before it can actually be used in production. So this is the anecdotal evidence at this point, but then we need to kind of collect information both from the release teams as well as end users to try to figure out, where are we going wrong? One anecdote that we got was one of the Prometheus metric stuff, which was causing either CPU or memory to be blown out of proportion, happened 3 times because people from 3 different SIGs merged code without realizing that it would break. So I don't know if Sander is here. He was the one who brought that up, which triggered me to raise this item here. So in general, what do you all, sorry, I shouldn't say guys, what do you all think about the issue here? Is this a valid concern? What is your experience? I wanted to poll the people here.
Tim, do you have a sense of whether it's getting better or worse?
Sorry?
Do you have a sense of whether the number of breakages per release is getting worse or better?
No, I don't have any data anecdotally either for that.
So since the beginning of the project, and I'm sure Jordan could probably speak at length to this too as well, he's smiling immediately, is that anyone who's worked downstream has never recommended .0 release, because I think this is in part because of our release process. We don't actually release a beta release and have sort of signal coming in from the wild before it actually gets blown out to the community. So our .0 release is pretty much like a beta release. That's the first point in time we actually get live signal back from the community.
Right. So the related to this is we do have retrospectives, but those are held by SIG release, and it covers only things that are of consequence to their working, and we don't have retrospectives either at the SIG level or at the overall project level. Is that a good thing to do? When do we do it? Who needs to be involved? Any thoughts there?
Something that I sort of informally collected myself that I think would be helpful to track for all of the changes that we put back into release branches, just categorizing them. Like, is this fixing a regression? Is this something that this release regressed that we're fixing? Or is this a bug fix that happens to be severe enough that we want to push it back? Just not a ton of really detailed information, but just kind of flipping a bit in each category. Like, is this a regression? Is this a security issue? Is this a bug fix? Or is this something else? Having that information, like the retrospectives are sometimes helpful for collecting how people feel about a release, but actually having numbers so we can see where are we regressing? What were those regressions centered around? I think that would be helpful. I can, I took a stab at collecting some of this by hand, and I can share that out. But if we wanted to make that part of the cherry pick process, when you take something back to a previous release, you need to explain, like, what is this? Why is it? What category does it fall into? We could consider that, and that might help inform us to your question about whether it's getting worse or better, and where we should be focusing effort.
So we should start from the SIG release side by adding some more information when things get cherry picked. That's where we would start. Do we want to go back to the current set of stable releases, and do we want to go figure out the state of affairs at this point?
Would that information be useful? Probably. I think it could be a good exercise. I'm not sure where it fits priority-wise.
Do we want to do this as a separate meeting and schedule a time for people to go poke around and bring back good information? Brian Grant, you're posting some information. Did you want to speak to it too?
Yeah, and I hadn't characterized the different commits, but I looked at numbers of commits in past releases that were in release branches. So I posted some of those to the chat. Of course, the most recent ones will have fewer just because fewer bugs have been encountered. Pretty much the .1 of every release has a few hundred already, which basically is an indication that that release is just not done, right? The way we do our release process, where we can neither change the release date nor change what goes into the release, means that whatever intermediate state stuff is in when we cut the release, that stuff will effectively need to just be finished after the first release. So this has been true ever since we implemented this policy in 1.3. And I think it's been getting worse rather than better over time. But we could easily see that just by looking at every release since 1.3. Of course, Q4 will always be less just because less goes into the Q4 release. And then, I think that 1.11 is the most recent release in wide use. So I would expect that to be approximately at steady state now. So, somewhere like 700 to 800 commits seems to be where they top out. Yeah, almost certainly a fair number of those commits are just loose ends of stuff that's not done. Then a smaller number will be reported bug fixes, and then a very small number is security emergency CVE type security patches. We really need to get to a state where we have just critical bug fixes in releases, because we have users who report breakage in patch releases, which is really not good, because then they can't even trust that they can upgrade to fix a critical problem. And since downgrade doesn't work either, that is not a good situation to be in. So we're trying to fix both of those things, I think. Both make downgrade work, and we need to get more diligent about what can go into patches. And this is why I'm a fan of feature branches. I think we need some way to gate what goes into releases. Other projects have Git flow and other sorts of patterns where stuff that gets checked into the development branch doesn't hit a release automatically. Like, there are multiple different ways to solve the problem. If we don't like release branches, we should find a different way. We can push everything to separate repos and have some sort of integration where we pin to known working versions or something. There are many ways to solve the problem. We just need to choose some set of solutions and move towards that if we're ever going to change the current situation. Otherwise, people will be using releases that are a year old. Like, anybody using it in production will just have to use old releases, because those are the only ones that have been sufficiently tested. If we look at some other projects, more test coverage obviously can help as well. And I don't even know that we have a credible information about what our test coverage is. But yeah, I mean, this is now that we have lots and lots of people using Kubernetes in production, this is increasingly becoming a concern, and this is where some of the pressure for things like LTS come from.
So, Tim?
Oh, sorry, Matt.
So I just have a meta point here is that should SIG release be owning these things in general? Like, I don't know if it's necessarily our purview. We can talk about it, sure, but I think there's kind of a responsibility of SIG release to manage and own and maintain this aspect. I do think that SIG release has been understaffed with the appropriate technical skills required to actually solve and fix some of these problems for some length of time. So perhaps we can channel efforts towards making awareness of the problem and trying to get folks engaged with that particular SIG.
I mean, if the fix to this is everybody uses feature branches, that seems outside the scope of SIG release, don't you think?
We could debate the merits of feature branches for a long time if we wanted to. We could talk about that.
I'm not suggesting we do that now. I'm just saying, like, it's the solution space certainly includes things that are larger scope than SIG release.
So can I suggest just a couple things before we pass it over to Quentin? We've talked about feature branches, and I think that would fall under the code organization subproject we have here. So DIMS, is that something you could add to the list of agenda items there, and we can now move that conversation there?
I'm not very sure about that, Matt. Just because there's a couple of things I wanted to, well, I should let Quentin speak first. Quentin, and then I'll speak after that.
Oh, that's very polite of you. Thanks, Dims. Just to follow quorum, I'll do that. So I just wanted to clarify those numbers of commits that you published there, Brian. Is that the number of changes that were applied to a release after the release?
No, they are the number of commits that were applied to the release branch after the branch was cut. So some, like, first couple of hundred are pre.0.
Oh, okay. So to some extent, those numbers are not useful, right? I mean, in the sense that
they are a roll-up of everything up patched into the release branch, including subsequent patch releases. So I actually dug deeper into that, and if you look at where the tags are posted, you can get more granular information. But like .1s typically contain 150 to 200 commits.
Probably what you want is these numbers after the .0.
Yes. Yeah.
So you're saying in just the first patch release, we have 150 commits over and above what went out in the initial release?
For at least a couple of releases that I looked at, that was the case, yes.
Good Lord, that is quite disturbing. Now, the reason I mentioned this was, if you look at those numbers, that you published, I mean, I guess the good news is we're not obviously getting a lot worse. I mean, all the numbers are bad for all those releases, but there's not a clear upward trend there. And the other number I had a quick look at.
Yes, it's time by. Right, 113 hasn't had as much time as 110.
Yeah, just in case you're checking, the naive way to query get will include merge commits. So like if you look between 111.0 and 111.1, it's 140, but if you exclude merge commits, it's 70. So 70 is still a lot, but it's not 150 anyway.
Yeah.
The other number, for what it's worth, that I had a quick look at is how many point releases we have per release. And that seems to vary between, kind of high single digits and low teens. But again, doesn't seem to have a, clear upward trajectory, which seems to imply we're not getting dramatically worse, unless that's covering up some other badness.
There's a reason for that, which is we typically wouldn't cut multiple patch releases per week, and there are about 12 weeks between minor releases. So,
okay, so that finds us at 12 point releases. Fair enough.
Yes.
I thought there might be a backstory there. Okay, thanks. I'm done.
Okay. So back to me. So again, we are covering just the release process here, but then actual technical issues that got regressed. I want to talk about that too, and I don't want to be that part of the code organization itself. So that's why I was suggesting that we have a separate meeting for that, just like the retrospective, and run by people who run the SIG release retrospective, and invite people from the SIGs and do this periodically, not like a one-time thing. Try to do this every release. That's what I was going for. Go ahead, Jordan.
Ken first.
So, is the vision to get to a point where when we cut a branch for release, the branch is basically an RC, and then we're not expecting a large number of commits to merge to it after that? Like, effectively, we expect that master is stable almost to release at that point, then we cut the release branch, or is that like out of scope?
My personal opinion is that that's effectively where we want to get. We can debate about which branch it is, whether it's master or some other branch.
Sure.
But there should be a branch that is releasable, and we incorporate changes that we feel are big.
Okay, cool, thanks.
So I think there are a lot of different dimensions to this. SIG release owns part of it. SIG testing owns part of it. The individual SIGs that run the components where we're seeing regressions more often own part of it. And so the best case scenario is all of those dimensions get engaged and own their part of the dimension. And the worst case scenario is all of them say, oh, well, there are other dimensions. And certainly SIG testing is dealing with this. And SIG testing says, oh, well, certainly SIG release is. And so making sure that the problem is visible and like we have numbers around these, it's reactive, but looking at history and saying, where have we seen problems? What kinds of problems have we seen? Will at least give us a place to start. And then say, all right, who owns this and who owns what aspects of it? And I think there will be multiple aspects. So you're right, Tim. SIG release will own some of it. SIG testing might have some input, and then particular SIG areas as well. But getting visibility to where we're seeing problems, I think, is the first step.
Okay, so can I ask a show of hands who wants to work with me on this so we can come up with like a spreadsheet with some information and then use that to do the next step, like setting up a meeting and then talk about stuff. Quinton, can you add your name to the agenda and say that you are interested in this? Anybody else? I'm looking for help.
I'm happy to kind of replicate what I did with the spreadsheet I linked, at least kind of explain what I was looking for and what I was considering regressions. So I can jump in as well.
Thanks, Jordan. Okay, if any, George, thank you. Please add your name. Okay, sounds good. That's all I had on this topic. Let's go to the next one. Matt.
All right, thank you. We have 3 other areas. I don't know if we'll get through them all. Brian, are you okay pushing the issue triage to the end and see how much time we have left for that? And if not, we can push it to next time?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. The next section we have is actually sub-project updates. I'm hoping that these will be much quicker than last week where we went into depth. I don't know how much has changed between then. So the first one we have up is API reviews. Jordan, I see your name next to it.
So we got the request out to SIG leads to start identifying people in their SIGs who are going to be participating, and about half of them have ponied up people, which is great. As we run into requests for other areas, we're reaching out to the ones who have not given us names individually, so we make sure to get them engaged. A few specific areas, we've broken out discussions. So I met with some of the folks from SIG Windows yesterday talking about their run as username identity needs around pods. And then I know Tim and Clayton met with some of the cluster lifecycle, cluster API, machine API people yesterday, to walk through some of their initial docs. So yeah, if you want to see the latest state, look at the project board. If there's something that is not getting attention, take a look at the board to see if it's even on anybody's radar. And if not, feel free to ping me and we can make sure it gets routed to someone so you can see where it is in the queue.
Thank you, Jordan. Did anybody have any questions or comments? Fantastic, thank you. The next one up we have is conformance. Tim?
It's delightfully kind of a boring update. We've been trucking along very steadily. Been making good progress. I believe we had like 11 approvals last round, and we should make good progress by the next time too as well. I do have an issue that I would like to bring up to SIG Arch for clarification. there's two guiding issues that exist inside of the main conformance doc. And I don't think there's ambiguity with regards to, I think there's a little bit of ambiguity with regards to people's understanding there and what actions they can take. So my request or my ask is for clarification and documentation about how they can change the tests according to those two bullet points. So for those who are not reading the doc or just listening, there's the two bullet points are anything that checks specific events are generated, as we make no guarantees around events. And the second one is anything that checks optional conditional fields such as reason or message. I understand the reasoning behind that, but people are confused by what they need to do or how they can go about doing it in concrete examples that show better usage.
This is the main conformance tests criteria doc that you're referring to, Tim?
Yep.
So what you would like is a PR against that doc that clarifies these points?
Yeah, or shows concrete examples of how people can make a change that's positive, that removes that, because it's difficult because there's a lot of implicit state built into the system versus explicit state machine. So a lot of the tests, if you actually do a grok of the entire test suite, there's on the order of hundreds of tests that fall into that category.
If there were examples of such tests covered during the meeting, could links to PRs against those tests or the locations of those tests be added somewhere, at least a couple of examples? So
sure, they were in the meeting notes. Yeah, they were in the meeting notes, and I'll paste them in this doc as well.
Yeah, or just link to the meeting notes, the other doc. That'd be fine. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? Okay, the next up we have code organization with Jordan and Dims.
I can say a few words before Jordan talks to it. The main thing that we've done is we've selected a time. We are going to do the alternate week when the SIG architecture is not meeting. So the same people on the call right now can join. So it's next Thursday, same time as now. So that was the main update from me. We've been chugging along on a few things, and including a change to HCD to remove I don't know how to say it, the UGORG package, which we removed from KK. We wanted to do the same thing in HCD. That went through, it's merged in master. I've done a backport, and that's going to go in next, and then we're going to cherry pick that back and see what gains we get. Jordan, did you have some other things to cover?
I was just going to highlight there were a couple bug fixes that were desired for the Azure cloud provider, and those pulling them in the easy way would have involved bumping, I think, about 50 dependencies. That's a good example of the kind of gridlock that we're in. And so recognizing that and asking for sort of more creative ways to bring in those fixes. So the Azure cloud provider maintainers were able to cut patch releases on older tags that pulled in just the fixes they needed. So that was great that they were able to do that. I think as we are making progress towards getting those things out of tree, asking people to be careful about huge sweeping changes and make targeted changes where possible, knowing that like 6-9 months down the road, hopefully a lot of these big dependencies will be out completely. So it's great that they were able to do that. I would just encourage all dependency reviewers to be sensitive to that and look for ways to avoid huge sweeping changes if we can.
Right. I'm hoping to send out a project board with the things that we've identified so far, so we can continue using a milestone or something like that, and just follow the normal processes that we do for the other projects. That's all I had. Any questions?
I had one brief question actually to the group. So a topic came up in the code organization discussion. I believe it was Clayton who mentioned that we should, have some guiding principles around how we reorganize code, where we reorganize it. So we've actually got concrete measurable improvements. And I sort of implicitly signed up to kind of potentially write such a document. I gave it some thought this week, and it occurred to me that it has some overlaps on. So what I'm thinking is that something like a very brief as possible, kind of a constitution, things we believe to be true, and that we sort of strive for with code organization. And I guess it's going to overlap to some extent into architecture and even possibly releases. So does such a document sound useful? And is there already such a document? It sounded like there wasn't one, in which case I'm happy to kind of corral a few people together and cobble something together. But if it's already done or doesn't seem useful, then I won't bother.
There are a few guiding principles in the vendor update doc. It could probably stand to be surfaced better and expanded. So I'll link to that if you want to take a look at the few bullet points that were there.
Yeah, that was a list of things that we asked people. If it falls in under one of these categories, then it's a good thing to try to do an update to the dependency, right, Jordan? That's the one you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a very narrow view on a particular change, but I think a bigger picture of like, what do we consider good? Is this moving in a good direction? Is probably not very clearly spelled out there.
Yeah, I think there are an approach that would make sense to me. There are certainly multiple approaches. Would be to write up some kind of user journeys of things we expect people to be able to do without extreme pain in terms of how they utilize our code, from the different personas, like contributors to specific components, the release team, people consuming the code from outside the project. Like if we can come up with a few scenarios that we want to be well supported, I think that would be one way to approach it.
Yeah, that's a good idea. It did occur to me there's kind of two different directions one can take. One is to say, these are the things we believe to be true, because, we probably anecdotally have a bunch of opinions like that. And associated with each one, explain why we think this is a good thing or this is a bad thing. And the other one is to start with, these are the things we want to be able to do. And then out of that falls a bunch of things that we have to adopt with respect to code organization, whatever, in order to be able to do those things. I'm not totally sure which of the two is most appropriate, but I can give it a shot and see what comes out.
The reason I ask the latter is because I don't know that we have figured out how to best organize our code.
Right. And Quentin, the other thing I always lean towards is the practicality of the advice that people can follow right now. Given the hole we are in, I would lean towards whatever makes it actionable.
Yeah, yes, no, I totally agree. I think it's useful to just put down what we believe to be true on a piece of paper so that we can actually either agree on some of the items or disagree on them. And if we disagree on them, we can delete them. Because I think some of the, we end up reorganizing code, and the reason we have debates about where the code should be or how it should be organized is because we haven't even agreed on, what we believe to be true. So that was sort of my thinking behind it. If we can at least agree on on the Constitution, then, the legal framework falls out of that as opposed to the other way around. All right. It sounds like people think it might be useful. I'll try and bash something together.
Thank you. Matt, back to you.
All right. The next topic we have on the agenda is something that showed up on the mailing list, but I don't know that there were any responses to it. It's brought to us by SIG Scheduling. It's how to host a project that's cross SIG. The example here is Kubernetes, which they're renaming to Volcano, or calling it that now. And so do we have somebody on to talk about that?
Quentin can speak to it, but we did talk about this in the steering committee yesterday, and the action item was Quentin would go back to Klaus and figure out if there are any changes to the direction based on the feedback that was given in the steering committee meeting.
Okay, and our stance, because we discussed this, the two SIGs are SIG scheduling and SIG apps, and so we discussed this in Monday's meeting of SIG apps, and the whole idea was we were okay with SIG scheduling owning this, and if we felt the need, we would engage with the project, our folks would go be in the owner's file and engage on it if that was the case, and so we are okay with SIG scheduling owning this subproject.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that, like what Matt said, we don't have any developers in SIG apps who are in the owner's files for the batch stuff or for Volcano, and we're very supportive of them doing the project if that's what they want to do, and we'd love to collaborate with them if they want our help, but we're not really co-owners of it at this point.
The issue is that it was cross-cutting across many more areas of the project than just those two. Like there's a container runtime, so that's SIG node. There's auto-scaling, so that's auto-scaling. There's probably a different CLI. There's, it's going to cross-cut like at least half a dozen other SIGs as the current scope is currently proposed.
Right. There are a few aspects to it. Like it's not for use by other people. It's not code that is directly imported by other projects. It's beyond the scope of the SIG scheduling as such. Then SIG node, they were talking about singularity. So it just mushroomed into a point where we said, this seems like something that needs to go in the CNCF level. So can you please explore that, was one of the suggestions that came out of the meeting yesterday. Anyway, the ball is in the court of Klaus and Quinton and other people who are proposing it. And they'll come back to us to see and tell us what they want to do next. Quinton, was there any update to that?
No, I think that's about it. I think it's safe to say, without wanting to preempt anything, I think it's safe to say that the inclination is to move it into the CNCF. That seemed like the preference of the steering committee, and it seems like the most practical thing. The reason we didn't do that initially was because this stuff is all fundamentally changes to the core of Kubernetes. So it seemed like it belonged in Kubernetes. It's not something built on top of Kubernetes or around it or plugging in the side. It's kind of like fundamental changes. I mean, admittedly using our extensibility mechanisms, but it is fundamentally changing or building new schedulers, building new container runtime interfaces, potentially building new kubelets, building new job abstractions, some of the fundamental workload abstractions of Kubernetes. So it sort of tasted a little different than something like Helm, which is, clearly built on top of Kubernetes. But the steering committee seemed to feel that that didn't mean that it shouldn't go into the CNCF. So we're going to explore that. And the other option is to, put a KEP together and sort of a different process to say, how could we accommodate this in a practical fashion inside the Kubernetes org or SIG's, structure? And so those are the two things on the table, and we'll figure out which one looks the best.
There is another alternative, and I don't know if you've considered it or if it's even attractive to you, but if you look at Kubeflow, for example, they're not quite at the point where they're implementing their own container runtimes, but they do implement a lot of different abstractions. They leverage a lot of different other things in the community. They built their own kind of just project and process outside of Kubernetes, even though they layer on top of it. So, I mean, you can go into the CNCF, but there's no need to actually do that if you would like to even have a lighter process.
Yeah, no, that is true. I mean, we do need it to be in a foundation and to be a sort of multi-company effort. And to be clear, I mean, Kubeflow actually runs on top of part of Volcano at the moment, which is called Kubatch. So there's a lot of overlap there. But yeah, there is a preference to have it, housed somewhere in a foundation like the CNCF. It seems to be, I mean, given that it's essentially changes to Kubernetes, it seems to belong in the CNCF somewhere, either directly in Kubernetes or in the CNCF. That's sort of the thinking.
All right, thank you for the update. That was much more detailed than I expected. So with that, we're on to the issue triage with Brian Grant. Brian, are you up for walking us through this?
Yeah, I can't share my screen though, but I just start talking. So a number of the SIGs are starting to do more issue triage during meetings, so it was suggested that we do that in SIG architecture as well to try to usually crowdsource the curation of our backlog. And that sounded like a good idea to me. So most SIG Arch issues are in just 2 repos, well, 3, I guess. Kubernetes had, especially a lot of the old ones that predate repo proliferation. But still, there are a significant number of ones in Kubernetes, 47 open issues tagged SIG architecture right now. The community repo, where some of the project contributor documentation lives, and the enhancements repo, which is where KEPs are. So I thought we'd just go through the Kubernetes repo and the community repo quickly. The general triage approach that I use, not just for SIG architecture, but generally, is to winnow down the set of issues that need to be addressed right now. So the first cut is SIG architecture the right categorization of the issue, or should it really belong to a different SIG or a set of SIGs? So that is the first determination to make. Really, SIG architecture is about creating the processes and policies that enable all the other SIGs to do the right thing and self-align. So it's really the generalization of issues that come up that should predominantly fall to SIG architecture. So if it is something that just affects one specific technical area of the project, like networking or storage, then it probably doesn't belong to SIG architecture. And the next consideration to make is how important or urgent is the issue, because if it's not important or urgent, then we can come back to it later. So we have some priority labels that we don't use consistently or rigorously across the project, and they're hard to maintain, much like help wanted labels and things like that. You need to make a pass over all of the backlog in order to, on a regular basis, in order to keep those up to date. But it's a mechanism that we have. So we can try to assign those labels to the issues, and now that we can do that, so anyway, people who are maintainers can just still change labels until that goes away. But also the bot commands. Just be aware that if you use a bot command to categorize or prioritize or assign, you'll get subscribed to the issue, and that's a pain point for me. I don't know how much of a pain point it is for other people. So then also remember to go unsubscribe if you don't actually want to follow that issue going forward. Having the right set of people monitor comments to issues, like updated questions or bug reports from users, is an unsolved problem in the project, and with GitHub generally, I would say. So like if any individual touches an issue at any time in the past, the updates will go to them, and if new people logically become the owners, they don't automatically get added. So even GitHub teams don't really solve this problem. So the only way that really works is some sort of polling, and go look at issues occasionally that we feel are important. Given the number of issues we have, that's not very feasible. So anyway, SIG architecture itself luckily doesn't have that many. The third is, if it is important or sufficiently urgent, then try to find someone to assign it to. So if we go and look through the set of issues right now, there are some recent ones that, for example, are code organization. So this is where we have also an effort to what we call formalize subprojects and plumb subprojects through all of our machinery. We really need per subproject labels. In the past, originally we had, well, not originally, but at some point in the past, I created a bunch of these area labels. Now it'd probably be more appropriate to have subproject labels. So that is something we still need to do. If someone is interested in helping contributor experience implement that, that would be awesome. Otherwise, Aaron will probably end up doing it wearing one of his many hats. But it would be great if someone else stepped up to help with that. So the first issue I'm looking at is this inconsistency of imports to core v1 package. I mean, just from reading the title, I would guess that that is maybe a code organization issue. You know, so sometimes it takes some context to read through the issue and understand what it is. I would just say, don't be afraid to ask others for advice or to punt it to someone else, or in fact, just to skip it and don't assign a priority if you're not sure, and someone else can come up with it on a pass, on the next pass. So with this number of issues, the first pass I would normally do is to not even open them up, but just try to guess by the title. I actually have to do this with my email also, because, or even more importantly with my email, I just have to decide which ones I will ever open based on the subject line. So this is probably something we should write in our contribution guidelines about how to write good issue titles. Hopefully someone's taking notes about all this. Because really, like if you're gonna triage a few hundred issues, you can't open all of them. GitHub is just too slow.
One of the large problems is that we're a multilingual community. So for a lot of people who are contributing, I see this particularly in SIG apps, who are contributing, English is not necessarily their first language. So looking at the issue title isn't necessarily like, it's not going to be enough in very many cases, and I can't.
So this is pointing out another problem with our automation, which is one thing you can do if you are if you have write access to the repo is you can edit the title. I don't believe we have a bot command for that, but that would be really great, is to have a command so that whoever does read the issue or PR and figure out what it's really about can actually fix the title so other people don't have to go through that same process. So there are some chats here. That's why clickbait titles are best. Yeah, except that doesn't work on me because I pretty much never read those.
I'm kidding. You should all use good titles.
Yes.
The max character length is the length that fits in the Gmail subject.
Yeah, like an ideal case is you would be able to even categorize whether it's a feature or a bug or something else from the title. Like this enhanced klog to split up log files when it grows to 1.8 gigabytes. I can read that. That's a pretty good title. I can read that and say, yeah, it probably has a reasonable categorization. Or network internet tests for pod fails on Azure, kind failing test. Yeah, that's probably, you know, thinking about that, well, why does that have a SIG architecture label? It's actually labeled SIG architecture, SIG Azure, SIG network, SIG testing. That suggests to me that someone was fishing. They actually didn't know where it should land. So you can get some of these, if you do the triage enough, you can see these kinds of patterns where you can figure out what likely action you're going to need to take for that issue. Like for this one, probably reducing the set of SIGs associated with that. You know, if everybody's responsible, then nobody's responsible. So that would probably be the action to take there. Probably SIG architecture is tagged because you know, if it's a conformance test, for example, ideally it would say that in the title, but if it were a conformance test, then they might be questioning whether this is a reasonable thing to test in conformance. We actually do have a conformance label, and that's not on this, so I don't know that that is the issue. So this is probably clickbaity enough that I would probably open it wearing my conformance hat and go figure out if that's related, and if it's not really SIG architecture, I would remove SIG architecture and any other SIGs I thought weren't really appropriate for that one to make sure it had the right SIG. You know, something like moving master-slave architecture to peer-to-peer, that sounds like it's a radical re-architecture. I would put that at lowest priority and move on. Because practically speaking, that's not, yeah, that's not happening, or I would just close it. Thank you for your suggestion, build your own system. So, I think really if you can winnow down to who is the right owner, what is the right priority, is there someone obvious who should take a look at it, either to work on it or to refine it further, like to figure out, is this an issue or not? Should it just be closed? That is something that just takes practice to do. And if someone is interested in helping with the triage, we could just go through them together, or you could just take a stab and see what fraction of them you're able to do on your own, and then provide that as feedback. As I was only able to figure out like 1 in 10, then probably we need to go through a more thorough process to onboard someone to triage. One thing we have been bad at is identifying roles in SIG architecture for other people to pick up. If we can't find someone to volunteer for issue triage, we could just create that as a role, issue triager, and post it to the role board and try
I
to.
was just about to suggest that it's one way of giving recognition to all the hard work that would go into this.
Yeah. So I think other SIGs have not taken advantage of that mechanism, but since I'm one of the people who proposed that mechanism, I would suggest if we don't have a volunteer right now that we do that, and then the chairs can work to, including me, can work to onboard that person in the process. But really the thing that unblocks progress on lots of things in the project, including issue triage, but also bug fixing and whatever, is just not being afraid to just jump in and see what you can figure out and ask questions when you can.
Brian, I think it's a good idea. Can you please create a role just like Tim did? And we already found somebody for Tim to help with the make files. So I think let's try this again for this one.
Filing the role was Brian's idea.
Right, and he's going to do it.
Yeah.
There are several people who cannot come to this meeting because of time zone issues, and I always go ping them to see if anybody's interested. So this will be a good thing for them.
Okay, Ken has his hand up, and then I have a simple follow-up question.
So we actually talked about doing something like this in SIG apps on Monday, like having a SIG apps triage role for issues. Is there anything more formal that's been like written down anywhere about what that role might look like?
I was about to suggest precisely the same thing. Yeah, I mean, and I could give it a bash, or if somebody else is better qualified.
We had a hand up.
Sorry.
You're muted.
Chris, you're muted.
Too many mute buttons. Contribx is actually in the middle of doing this exact thing right now. There's a PR in flight. I'll put it in the chat to create some issue triage guidelines for us, but they're also like issue triage guidelines are usually pretty general. There might be some extra like SIG specific ones to add in there. If you have comments, please respond on the PR, and hopefully we can get something that is maybe general across all the SIGs, and then like architecture, any of the other SIGs that have specific extra things that they'd want to add for their issues, we can get it together in a common guide.
Can I'd actually disagree with the consensus. I think it's not good to have a few siloed people go off and do your triage. I think doing a group triage is a great way for newcomers to your space to learn the scope of your SIG or project or whatever. It's a good training exercise, and even if it's still like a couple of senior people providing most of the input to the meeting, like it's good for everybody else to observe their thoughts.
Right. Yeah, the problem is those people are not in this time zone, so they can't come to this meeting. If we set up another Asia Pacific friendly time, then I can get some more people who are interested in doing this work to show up.
I'd also add that it may not be mutually exclusive. Like you could do both, like if you record a triage session with the logic from the senior folks in the group that can say like, oh, this is why we're deciding this goes here. This is why we're deciding this goes here. And then have a mechanism to like train and mentor new people into that as well. You might be able to get a larger group together that's willing to do the work.
Just looking at the list of people who are currently on, we don't have people who with time or the thing to take this on, right? So we need to find new people. Basically, that's what I'm trying to say.
Ken?
I was just saying, like, that is kind of the context in which we were talking about in SIG apps, and we wanted to help. Like, we thought this might be a good way to help build contributorship and eventually like reviewership by starting off with triaging issues and triaging bugs. We were looking at it more from potentially like the same way that Jordan has the API reviewer shadowing and Tim have the, like maybe you could do shadow reviewership for a couple of bugs or a couple of issues, shadow triage. And from there, because that can be done asynchronously without respect to time zone. And then from there, help grow them out.
Do we have any other comments on this? Does who's got the action to take this to next steps?
I do.
Brian does? Okay. I'll note that here.
This isn't exactly what, this is kind of what we're talking about. Something we found helpful in some of the other SIG is just kind of looking at each dimension, like is categorizing what kind it is separately from priority. And sometimes it's easier to do that. So like have a query that says, show me everything that isn't categorized at all. And just put it in a bucket. Like don't think about priority, don't think about anything else. And then look at everything that's unprioritized. And that can kind of help chip away at it and give you better signal without trying to bite off all decisions at the same time. Yeah.
So on that topic, I opened an issue with Contribex a month and a half ago-ish about adding a new label that comes into all issues by default. Is set basically saying triage needed or SIG act required or something. There was some debate about what the semantic really was. As far as I know, there was general agreement that we could do that. I don't think it's actually been done. But like I need this in SIG network too, so I can keep track of which of the hundreds of backlog issues have been triaged and which ones still need to be triaged.
We have our own mechanism.
We're abusing the triage unresolved label right now in SIG network, but this other label that comes in automatically would be strictly better. So maybe we can add fuel to the fire on Tribex.
I can track down where that issue was. I remember some discussion around it, but I know for sure it has not been actioned. Like it wasn't on our radar for our meeting this week.
Right.
So back to the specific one, Brian, can you and I record like a 15-minute triage session and then which we can show it to other people and get to bootstrap them?
Yes, I also had taken down some notes to write up the basic process and how to improve it for other people, including how to mark that something is issued, been triaged, or how to infer it from the set of labels that are on it. So I'll put a little bit of thought into the proposed process and whether we have adequate mechanisms or there are easy ones that we can add to improve it a little bit, and then we can do that.
Okay, I'll wait for you to ping me then. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to jump in here with just a quick time check here. We've got less than a minute left. So I just wanted to say thank you. Brian, was there any closing words you had on this?
No, not really, other than, we're trying to get the SIG Arch to be more productive and effective. So getting our act together with the issue triage is yet another step there. If you have other thoughts about improving execution of the SIG, definitely offer up your ideas either on the email list or in a future meeting.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And with that, it's meeting time's done. We'll be back here again in 2 weeks. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.